Trigger warning. Before we begin, I want to let you know that this episode covers some incredibly difficult topics. It's heavy. Racially motivated violence, lynching, systematic racism, and discrimination against immigrants. I'll also touch on political issues today that may feel heavy or stressful, especially given what's going on in our world. If these subjects feel like too much right now, that's totally okay. You can pause, come back later, or just skip this episode. Take care of yourself as we explore this painful but important chapter of history, because while it may be far in the past, the echoes are still with us today.
Bygone Echoes.
Hey there, history lovers and curious minds. Welcome to Bygone Echoes, a history podcast where we uncover the good, the bad, and the downright horrifying ways humans have treated each other throughout history. I'm your host, Courtney, and I'm so glad that you chose to be here. I'm excited. Chinese Lunar New Year begins this Wednesday, and it's a time of joy and renewal for many Chinese and other Asian communities around the world. But as I worked on this episode, it really struck me how much resilience it takes to carry a sense of hope forward, even after unimaginable hardships. The Chinese community of LA in 1871, the focus of today's story, was one such community. Despite enduring horrific violence and systematic racism, their strength and perseverance remind us that, even in the darkest moments, survival itself is an act of defiance. For me, today's topic is a little too relevant. I admit that it's been unsettling to research. And let me confess before we start, this year I actually planned out the episodes for the podcast, in advance. Yes, I am super duper proud of myself. The goal is one episode per month because since I've chosen to fly solo on this podcasting journey, doing it all on my own does take time. So I was going to wait until February to cover this topic because in addition to planning it out, I also try to finish at least one book on the topic, but I couldn't wait until February. This story feels way too urgent, and I'm not afraid to admit it. I have big feelings about what is going on in the place that I call home, the USA. And I need to talk about this right now. Today we are traveling back to Los Angeles, California in 1871, a time where the city was a budding community, far removed from the vibrant, world-famous cultural hub that it's become today. Back then, LA was a rough-and-tumble frontier town with barely 6,000 residents. It was the kind of place where lawlessness was the norm, racial tensions ran high, and violence lurked around every corner. It's also the setting of one of the deadliest racially motivated massacres in U.S. history. Picture this. A mob of 500 vigilantes storming through Chinatown, dragging Chinese immigrants out of their homes and businesses, lynching them from makeshift gallows, and then leaving their bodies as a grim display of deep-seated hatred. By the end of the night, 19 Chinese immigrants were murdered. It was chaos, it was barbaric. And here's the part that will make your blood boil. Almost no one was held accountable. And yet, I bet most of us never heard about the 1871 Chinese Massacre in school. It is not exactly your standard American history textbook story, and it's rarely talked about in the context of violence and racism that have actually worked to shape this country. Why? Maybe because it's easier to forget, or maybe it's because it was so poorly documented. Racial violence like this wasn't exactly remarkable back then, or maybe because it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about how deeply racism and xenophobia are embedded in our history. Now, here is where things get even more unsettling. As I'm recording this, it is January 2025, and we are watching a new wave of political policies and rhetoric that sound eerily similar to the forces at play in 1871. Immigrants are once again being scapegoated. Fear-mongering is in full swing, and policies like mass deportations, the end of birthright citizenship, and the reinstatement of Remain in Mexico rule are being rolled out as we speak. The echoes of 1871 are not just faint whispers of the past, they are loud, jarring screams. Okay, deep breath. That was a lot. And trust me, this story only gets heavier. But that's why it's important to tell, because even the darkest moments in history have lessons for us today. So, what does the Chinese Massacre of 1871 teach us about America's long history of using immigrants as scapegoats? And what does it really reveal about who we are as a country today? Because, let's be serious, history is not just about old facts. It's about patterns. It's about choices. And most importantly, it's about deciding whether we want to keep repeating the same mistakes or break the cycle, which we've shown that we can do time and time again. The awesome part about all of this is that we get to choose. We all have a part to play, whether we like it or not. Today, we will dig deep into this tragic chapter of U.S. history. We'll unpack the events leading up to the massacre, explore the racist systems that made it possible, and connect it to immigration policies shaping the United States right now. Together, we will ask, what does this say about who we are and who we want to be as a society? Let's get into it. Let's talk about 1871 for a second, because the world at that time was busy. Globally, nations like Germany and Italy were unifying, and workers in France were rising up in revolution. While the transatlantic slave trade had officially ended by this time, the effects of it still lingered in Africa. Unfortunately, regions have been left depopulated, economies disrupted, and communities and societies destabilized after centuries of abduction, forced labor, and violence. The Qing Empire, what we now call China, was straight up falling apart. Decades of chaos, poverty, and foreign interference have left the country barely able to hold itself together. Southern China, in particular, was hit the hardest, with millions of people just trying to survive after various wars, including the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion, and wave after wave of natural disaster. Floods along the Yellow River destroyed farmland and displaced millions, while droughts in the south left families with nothing to eat. These disasters triggered waves of famine, forcing people to sell everything they had or try to relocate if they could. The Taiping Rebellion was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, claiming an estimated 20 to 30 million lives. It left southern China in ruins, forcing countless families to make impossible choices just to survive. The rebellion lasted almost a quindecade. I just learned that word, by the way. That's 15 years in case you, like me, are not up to date on your obscure units of time. And also, we're saying 30 million people, right? It's so abstract. Like, what even is 30 million? So let's break it down. Imagine the entire population of Australia wiped out. Gone. To put it another way, during the rebellion's 14 years, nearly 4,000 people died every single day. And while I don't like measuring tragedies and 9/11s, let's go there for a second because it has been suggested that some people find that easier to grasp. That's the equivalent of a 9/11 tragedy happening every single day for over a decade. No breaks, no weekends, no holidays. It is 365 days a year, 7 days a week, and don't forget the extra day when you have a leap year. So the Taiping Rebellion was not just a conflict, it was a human catastrophe on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. And for a lot of people in China, staying there wasn't an option, it was life or death. But the United States, on the other hand, they had a promise of something for immigrants. But what was the U.S. even up to at that time? Well, friends, the Reconstruction was well underway, and for the first time ever, Black Americans were being granted rights. Well, the men were, at least. They had rights. Black men could vote, they could hold office and participate in government, but the white majority did not handle that very well. White supremacists, led by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, had a very hard time managing their feelings about sharing power or being seen as equals. Instead of sitting with that discomfort and maybe, rethinking their worldview, they acted out violently. Lynchings, voter intimidation, and outright terrorism became the go-to strategies as they did everything in their power to drag the country back to a time when they didn't have to share their status at the top and that their power went completely unchallenged. Meanwhile, out west, white settlers weren't behaving much better. They snatched up indigenous lands by breaking treaties, violently displacing indigenous peoples, and routinely committing atrocities. The recently completed Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 had supercharged westward expansion. It was now easier than ever for settlers to flood into indigenous territories. The railroad also brought Chinese laborers to the region. The men who had worked tirelessly to build it were now being scapegoated and excluded from opportunities that it created. For some, this was a time of promise and progress and opportunity. The world was their oyster. But for others, it was loss, destruction, and devastation. Our story takes place on the West Coast, a land of contrast. Cities like San Francisco were booming, fueled by the gold rush and sustained by immigration and trade, while smaller towns like Los Angeles were still transitioning from sleepy pueblos to bustling urban centers. And again, it was a place of opportunity for some, but that opportunity was often built on the backs of marginalized groups like the Chinese immigrants, indigenous people, and Mexican Californians. At the same time, it was rough and it was lawless and it was deeply unequal, with racial tensions simmering just below the surface, or, as we will see in this story, exploding into violence. Once upon a time, the Los Angeles area was known as the Yanga and was the ancestral home of the Tongva, or Gabrielino people. It covered just 28 square miles, basically a little bit bigger than a marathon course. Back then, the area was known for its vast open spaces with rolling hills, wide plains, and dry riverbeds. The Tongva people had lived in the region for thousands of years, and a small population still resides there today. The Tongva have a spiritual connection to this area, and it's central to their identity, emphasizing respect, stewardship, and a deep understanding of the natural world's intrinsic value. Tongva society traditionally revolved around honoring nature, hunting, gathering, and basket weaving. I did read that they were also a seafaring people, but the sources sort of conflicted, so I'm not sure exactly. But unfortunately, by the 19th century, the Tongva population had been nearly wiped out. First, the Spanish rolled in the late 1700s and forced the Tongva people into the mission system, where they were essentially enslaved, converted to Christianity, and stripped of their culture. Then, when Mexico took over in 1821, the missions were replaced by ranchos, huge land grants handed to wealthy Mexican settlers. The Tongva, still pushed aside, now working as low-paid laborers on the very lands that had belonged to them for generations. And then, after the U.S. annexed California in 1848, white settlers swept in, snatching up the rancheros for themselves, stole even more land, and violently displaced what was left of the Tongva community. By the time Los Angeles officially became a U.S. city, the Tongva were almost entirely erased from the narrative. In 1871, the city's layout revolved around its early Spanish and Mexican roots. The center of town was the plaza, a cluster of adobe buildings near what is now Alvera Street, and that was about it. It included the Plaza Church, which had been built in the 1820s. Calle de los Negros, a narrow street near the plaza, had earned a reputation for being one of the city's most lawless and violent areas, both a hub of activity and a reflection of LA's darker side. It was full of gambling halls, saloons, and brothels, and it was also where many immigrants lived, worked, and ran small businesses. The population in 1871 sat around 6,000 people, so it was more of a rough frontier outpost than a bustling city. It was dwarfed by larger California cities like San Francisco, which had boomed thanks to the gold rush. LA, meanwhile, still felt remote, sort of tucked away in the southern part of the state and isolated from the more developed regions up north. About 60% of the city was made up of white settlers, who controlled most of the land and wealth. The Mexican Californio population, once the majority, had dropped to about 20%, with many reduced to tenant farmers or laborers after losing their land. Indigenous peoples, including the Tongva and African Americans, each made up less than 5% of the population, often pushed to the edges of society or reduced to low-paid labor. The Chinese immigrant community in LA was small, around 200 people total, which, if I tried to math, that's like 180 men and just about like 20 women and children, maybe-ish. Though not exact numbers, the staggering gender imbalance was not an accident. Immigration laws, cultural expectations, and economic realities made it nearly impossible for Chinese women to immigrate. For those who did make it to the U.S., their lives were usually marked by unimaginable hardship, as they were treated as property and exploited for profit, aka prostitution. Many of the men were young, in their late teens or early 30s, sent by their families to earn money to send back home. And life in America? It wasn't easy. These men worked brutal, back-breaking jobs that literally no one else wanted. Long hours in laundries, tending fields under the blazing sun, or working as cooks and gardeners for white families. That was their day-to-day. And the pay? It was $2 a week. That's like $50 today. Weekly, not daily. White workers could earn almost triple that amount. But compared to life back in China, where famine and everything going on back then meant no wages really, these meager earnings were well worth it. Every penny sent home could keep their family fed. They wore traditional Chinese clothing and the Q hairstyle mandated by the Qing dynasty, a long braid that became an easy target for ridicule and even physical attacks. Their appearance was weaponized against them, making them more visible as the other. But for all the hardships that they faced, Chinese immigrants built a tight-knit community to survive. Most of them lived near Calle de los Negros, a crowded area near the plaza that would eventually evolve into what can be considered the first Chinatown. The community was well structured around kinship networks, regional ties from back home, and benevolent associations which helped immigrants with everything from finding housing to paying funeral expenses. At the top of the community were merchants and shopkeepers, men who had a little bit of financial stability and owned small businesses. And at the bottom were laborers, crammed into overcrowded housing and barely scraping by. In this community, you also had figures like Dr. Jean Tong, a man in his 30s who was highly respected. He was a herbalist and a Chinese community leader in LA. He was beloved by his patients, both white and Chinese. He and his wife, Cheng Wan, lived together in a tiny apartment with their pet poodle. And they also had a tenant, which I saw as like helping the community grow. But like any community under pressure, tensions existed within. Many Chinese immigrants organized themselves into groups based on kinship or regional ties from their homeland, leading to the formation of tongs. The word tong, derived from Cantonese, means meeting hall or hall of gathering. These organizations initially served as a social support network, helping immigrants navigate life in a foreign land. However, some tongs eventually evolved into criminal enterprises involving drug trafficking, prostitution, gambling, and even slavery. Rivalries formed quickly in Los Angeles as these groups clashed over control of gambling operations, territory, women, and money. These disruptions often escalated from verbal arguments to outright bloody confrontations. But overall, it was a good thing the community had those internal structures because white Los Angeles was anything but welcoming. White settlers blamed Chinese workers for stealing jobs, quote unquote, even though the Chinese immigrants were often doing the work that white laborers didn't want. Doesn't that sound familiar? Newspapers ran racist editorials portraying Chinese people as dirty, immoral, and inherently criminal, and physical harassment was almost a daily occurrence. White children would spit on Chinese workers, throw rocks at them, or kick them in the streets. Adults were no better, pushing them off sidewalks, shouting slurs, and mocking them for their clothing and hairstyles. And that's just the small stuff. Larger acts of violence, mob attacks, lynchings, they were all too common. Remember, this is 1871 LA we're talking about, a city already infamous for its lawlessness and high murder rates. The anti-Chinese sentiment simmering in the city was not new. It had been building for years, stoked by economic fears, racist propaganda, and the belief that the Chinese people did not belong. It was in this highly volatile environment that two rival tongs, the Hongqiao Company and the Ningyoung Company, came to blows. Before we discuss the incident itself, quick disclaimer. The sources I used varied on specifics at the time, omitted details entirely, changed details, and conflicted one another, so please keep in mind that below is not the gospel truth. Thanks. In October 1871, a young Chinese woman named Yet Ho lived in Los Angeles, though perhaps lived is not quite the right word to use. She survived. Barely. The streets she walked every day, the crowded and dusty blocks of Calle de los Negros, were both her prison and her battleground. Yet Ho, like many other Chinese women in Los Angeles at the time, hadn't chosen this life. She had been brought to the city against her will and sold into sexual slavery by men who saw her as nothing more than a commodity. Chinese women were seen as pawns, something to be controlled, fought over, and exploited for profit. Escape was almost impossible. Even if a woman managed to flee, the men who claimed ownership of her would come after her. And worse, sometimes the police, the very people tasked with maintaining order, would help these men find her, dragging her back in exchange for a bribe. And that was Los Angeles, a city rife with corruption, violence, and systematic exploitation. But on this particular October day, Yet Ho's life was thrust into the center of the storm. She had been kidnapped, or maybe she escaped, or forcibly married so that she would legally belong to another Tong, though no one ever bothered to ask her side of the story. What she wanted did not matter. To them, she was a prize, a source of power and profit, and her disappearance would ignite a feud that had been simmering for months. The fight broke out in the streets of Calle de los Negros. Members of the rival Tongs, both armed, exchanged gunfire in broad daylight. The shouting and the gunshots echoed through the streets, drawing attention from the police and curious onlookers. People were wounded. Enter Robert Thompson, a white rancher and former saloon owner who decided to step into the chaos. Whether he thought he was keeping the peace or just couldn't mind his business, one thing was clear. He escalated the situation. Armed and overconfident, he walked into a fight that was not his to handle, despite being warned by multiple bystanders to stay back. Thompson ignored the warnings, and he decided to fire shots into the building where a few of the Tong members were hiding. Then, bold as ever, he entered the building, gun drawn, and whatever happens next is murky. But what is true is when he stepped back through the doorway, bang bang, he was shot in the chest. Bystanders carried Thompson to a local apothecary, but the damage was too severe, and he died shortly after. Word of his death spread rapidly through the tiny town of Los Angeles. Because Thompson was not just any man. He was white, well-off, and well-known, the kind of person who symbolized power and control in 1871 Los Angeles. His death wasn't seen as the result of his own reckless decision to walk into a Tong conflict armed. It was framed as an attack on the entire white community. Literally, people spread the word that the Chinese were taking up arms and killing all the whites. To many, it was an excuse that they had been waiting for to lash out at the community's small but growing Chinese community. By nightfall, 500 people, that's nearly 10% of the Los Angeles population at the time, had gathered armed with guns, knives, and ropes. Most were white, but some were Mexican, drawn in by their own resentment toward the Chinese, often fueled by economic competition and years of anti-Chinese propaganda. It is wild to think about how quickly they mobilized, right? This started in the afternoon. Thompson died just a few hours later, and what nightfall in October is around 6 p.m.? At least it is where I live. So between lunchtime and dinner time, 500 people were organized, armed, and ready to commit heinous acts of violence against a community that made up just a tiny fraction of the city's population. Another source said that the mob actually gathered like 2 hours later. But what I want to stress is that this was not a random act. This was not a one-off unique event. The mob and all their hatred did not form out of thin air. Years of anti-Chinese sentiment stoked by systematic racism, economic fears, and a culture that normalized violence against people who represented the other, in this case, specifically the Chinese, had laid the foundation for this moment. Hatred like this does not just appear overnight. It's just not just a couple of bad people. It festers and it boils over, and it has the horrifying ability to bring people together in the worst way imaginable. And this mob did not waste time. Once organized, they made their way down to Calle de los Negros and descended upon the community with terrifying speed. Homes and businesses were looted, vandalized, and or burned. People were dragged out into the streets and brutally attacked. I found a quote on the LA City Historical Society website from one of the white witnesses who reported,
"News of the attacks and counterattacks spread like wildfire. 433 and a mob of 1,000 or more, frenzied beyond control, armed with pistols, guns, knives, and ropes, and determined to avenge Thompson's murder, assembled in the neighborhood of the disturbance. A Chinese man, waving a hatchet, was seen trying to escape across Los Angeles Street, and Romo Sorderell captured him. The crowd was yelling, 'Hang him! "Shoot him." He was dragged up Temple to New High Street, where the familiar framework of the corral gates suggested its use as gallows. With the first suspension, the rope broke, but the second attempt to hang the prisoner was successful. Other Chinese men whose roofs had been smashed in were rushed down Los Angeles Street to the south side of Commercial, and there, near Goler's wagon shop, between wagons stood on end, were hung.
The mob was indiscriminate when it came to lynching. It didn't matter if it was men or boys. They eagerly snatched up anyone they could get their hands on. Some victims were lynched from lampposts, wagons, and hastily built gallows, and their bodies were left hanging as a message to survivors. You'd think that with 500 people descending on this community, this narrow strip of the neighborhood, the police would have stepped in. And it is recorded that a few officers did step up, and a couple of citizens did try to intervene, I think like 11, but they were either overpowered or ignored completely. Some accounts even suggest that certain police officers participated in the violence themselves. By 9 p.m., nearly all of the Chinese residents who hadn't managed to escape earlier in the evening had either been captured by the mob or found refuge in the city's jail or with friendly shopkeepers and homeowners who offered them shelter. This part definitely makes me feel some kind of way. Like, not everyone was committing atrocities or idly watching them occur. It reminds me of that quote by Nancy, the mother of the infamous Mr. Rogers, who would tell him when awful things happened, always look for the helpers. There will always be helpers. When morning came, the citizens of Los Angeles were faced with the horrifying aftermath of the night's violence. The streets of Chinatown were littered with destruction. Survivors were left traumatized and terrified. Among the devastation were the bodies of 18 Chinese men and a boy, some mutilated in addition to being lynched, and all left on display for the entire world to see. Among the victims was Dr. Jean Tong, who had pled for his life. He offered money to be spared, but his neighbors shot him in the face and then hung his body for all to see. I cannot help but think about Billie Holiday's haunting song, Strange Fruit. You know, the one that talks about bodies hanging from the poplar trees. And I know that that song was written decades later and it was about the lynching of Black Americans, but those words echo here too, because the purpose of lynching was always the same: terror. It wasn't just about killing the person, it was about sending a message, a grotesque public display meant to dehumanize an entire community. And in this moment, that message was aimed squarely at LA's Chinese residents. You don't belong here, you're not safe, and no one will protect you. And of note, not a single victim had anything to do with the earlier shooting. Not a single person the crowd murdered was to blame. They weren't involved in the Tong feud. They were not involved in the fight over Yet Ho. They were all just living their lives, trying to survive in a city that was hostile to their very existence. The massacre shocked the nation. Newspapers coast to coast picked up the story, and LA, in what feels more like an obligatory move, launched the coroner's inquest. Indictments followed, and eventually 9 men were convicted of manslaughter. Justice, right? Wrong. They received sentences of 2 to 6 years in San Quentin State's prison. But here's the kicker. A year later, they were all released. Why? Because of some alleged technical flaw in the indictments. Ultimately, no one was held accountable for the deaths or the destruction that was caused. For the survivors, some fled LA entirely, terrified that the violence would happen again. Others stayed, trying to rebuild in a city that had shown them that, in no uncertain terms, that their lives did not matter. By the time the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 passed, the community had already endured years of violence, discrimination, and isolation. The Chinatown that we know today was not actually created until the 1930s. The original Chinatown, it would never fully recover. So let's talk about the aftermath of the Chinese Massacre of 1871 and what it says about justice, accountability, and the system that allowed this violence to happen in the first place. Spoiler alert, this part is not any less infuriating than the massacre itself. As mentioned, no one was held accountable. I mean, the trial was never about justice for the Chinese community. It was a performance. It was the city of Los Angeles saying, look, we're doing something. We're not total monsters. When in reality, they were doing the bare minimum. The legal system wasn't designed to protect marginalized groups. The system was there to protect the mob, or at least the white majority that made up most of it. And here is another layer of frustration: the role of law enforcement. Police were not exactly the heroes in this story. The massacre happened in plain sight over the course of hours. This wasn't a quick, uncontrollable riot. It was calculated, deliberate, and sustained. The police could have done more, and they should have done more. But in a little frontier town, a town where the anti-Chinese sentiment was normalized, the people tasked with enforcing the law sadly often shared the same prejudices of the mob. If we zoom out, the lack of accountability for the massacre isn't surprising when you consider the broader legal and social context of the time. In 1871, Chinese immigrants were legally not allowed to testify against white people in court under California law. Let that sink in. Even if there had been witnesses who could testify to every single person who was in that mob, their voices legally could not have been heard. And this law was not some outdated technicality, some accident that just happened. It was a deliberate tool to dehumanize Chinese people and strip them of legal protections. And it wasn't unique to Chinese immigrants. Similar laws had been used to disenfranchise indigenous people, African Americans, and other marginalized groups. It was a system that said loud and clear, your life does not matter as much as theirs. And let's not forget about the media, because the newspaper played a huge role in stoking the flames of anti-Chinese hatred. Leading up to the massacre, local papers routinely published racist cartoons and editorials portraying Chinese immigrants as dirty, immoral, and a threat to society. After the massacre, a lot of those same newspapers either downplayed the violence or straight up justified it. They tried to spin the mob as avenging Robert Thompson, conveniently ignoring the fact that Thompson had absolutely no business inserting himself into the chaos. He made the decision to roll up, guns blazing, acting like some Wild West hero, and basically got himself killed. He did that to him. Like, this specific tragedy could have been avoided if he had minded his damn business. Even national papers that condemned the violence often did so in ways that still dehumanized the victims. They treated the massacre as a tragedy for Los Angeles, the place, not for the Chinese community. The narrative was less, how could this have happened to these innocent people, and more of, wow, that city looks bad. One of the most challenging parts of researching the massacre is the lack of documentation. Wikipedia is my friend, but I also look for scholarly sources and books and first-hand accounts or like newspapers from the time. Some sources mention fires, while others don't. Some accounts suggest that women and children were also dragged out and beaten, but there is no clear consensus. Some say bodies were left naked and dangling and mutilated, but not all accounts share that detail. It could just be my shoddy research. In my rush and passion on this topic, I was not as thorough as I usually am, and I really hope that I'm not doing this traumatic event a disservice, because that is really not my intention. The survivors, if I were to math it, it's 160-ish men, and women and children, I imagine. And their voices are largely missing from the story, not because they didn't exist, it's not that they didn't say anything, but because the legal and social systems in place silenced them. I did see a few sources where Cheng Wan, the wife of Dr. Tong, accused the Chinese man of inciting the violence, because remember, legally she can't accuse anyone white of anything, but it didn't sound like anything really came of that. The absence of accounts from the people directly impacted is a reminder of how systematic racism doesn't just destroy lives, it erases them from history. And so what does this tell us? It tells us that the Chinese Massacre of 1871 was not just some one-off atrocity. It was the product of a much larger system of oppression. And it shows how power structures protect themselves, how justice is anything but fair, and how marginalized communities are left to fend for themselves in a world that is actively stacked against them. And here's the thing. It's still happening. Sure, the specifics might look different. We call it remain in Mexico or rebuild structures and systems with the goal of keeping people out. But the blueprint has not changed. Immigrants are still scapegoated. Marginalized communities are still disproportionately targeted. And justice? It feels like something that's out of reach unless you're on the right side of power. Laws might look different on paper, but the patterns, racism, xenophobia, inequality, they are all still there. I want to share something personal here, but I also want to say up front that I know my experience is not the same as what the Chinese community went through in 1871. But I do think it's important to reflect on how these dynamics of being othered play out in our lives, even today. For me, it looks a little like this. I am a person of mixed race, and I can't even count the number of times that I have been treated differently because of the way that I look. If you look at me, I am what people like to call racially or ethnically ambiguous. Am I black? Am I white? Or maybe part of another group, Hispanic, Middle Eastern? Over the years, people have assumed that I am Cuban, Colombian, Puerto Rican, Italian, Arab, you name it. And let me tell you, that has brought its own unique set of experiences. Sometimes it's harmless when someone assumes I'm from a certain region and starts speaking to me in that language. And there I am, deer in headlights, stumbling to explain that no, I do not understand. And somehow I still feel bad because I feel like I've let them down for them thinking that I belong to something I didn't belong to, but that's a whole other thing. Other times, though, it's not as harmless. Sometimes it's ignorance, unwanted physical contact, hostility, or outright exclusion. And it's strange, isn't it? How something as basic as the way people perceive you, the box they think that you fit into, can shape how you're treated, as though you belong or as though you don't. Social relationships and interactions and structures are just so fascinating. But again, I know this is not the same as xenophobia, but it has given me a glimpse into how these perceptions of difference and of other, of who belongs in the group and who does not belong in the group, can shape a person's entire life. And it definitely shaped mine. At the heart of what happened in 1871 was this very idea. The Chinese community was not seen as part of the group. They were scapegoated, vilified, and dehumanized because they were considered outsiders. They were the others. When a society normalizes those kinds of assumptions, when being different is seen as a threat, it opens the door for fear, hatred, and violence to take root. I mean, look at it right now. It's the year of our Lord 2025, and we are watching policies roll out that feel like echoes of the same history. And I'm sitting here, upside down, smiley face emojiing, like, seriously, guys, we're doing this again? The majority of you are really ready to do this again because it worked so well in the past, right? Right? Deep breath. Immigrants are being cast as the enemy, just like the Chinese immigrants in 1871. Mass deportation, the end of birthright citizenship, and forcing asylum seekers to wait in Mexico. It's all about creating an us versus them narrative. These policies don't just enforce borders, they enforce fear, dehumanization, and the idea that some people don't belong. What happens when communities are allowed to be treated this way? Families are torn apart. People live in constant fear, afraid to even step outside their homes. Workers are exploited because they can't afford to demand better treatment, or they're too scared to make waves. Survivors of violence don't report their trauma because they don't trust the system to protect them. That's what happened in 1871, and it's what's happening to immigrant communities today. Mothers are terrified that they'll be ripped away from their children. Workers are vilified just for existing. Neighbors are rebranded as criminals just because they wanted a better life. And much like in 1871, it's not about the individuals. It's about targeting entire communities. These policies send a message, the same message as 1871. You're not safe, you're not welcome, and you don't matter. Just like the mobs of Los Angeles, these actions are fueled by fear and hatred, and it's designed to maintain power for some by keeping others down. And remember, this hatred, it doesn't just appear out of thin air. It takes time. It's stoked. If you zoom out, you can see the same story repeating over and over again. In 1871, the Chinese were scapegoated as job stealers, dirty, and dangerous outsiders. In the 1930s, it was Jewish refugees fleeing Europe. In the 1940s, it was Japanese Americans thrown into internment camps. And today, it is Mexican and Central American immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. The names and faces might change, but the playbook is the same. And every single time, people look back and ask, how could we let this happen? But here's the question. What are we doing right now to make sure this is not just another chapter in that playbook? Because every time we choose silence, every time we choose to look the other way, every time we choose not to get involved, we allow these things to happen. Scapegoating immigrants has never been about solving actual problems. It's about power. It's about distraction. It's about giving people something to blame so that they don't look harder at the real issues. Things like wealth inequality, obvious and hidden corruption, or systematic exploitation. And while politicians stir up fear and pass these laws, there are people profiting from it. You have corporations exploiting immigrant labor for pennies on the dollar, politicians scoring points with their base by blaming society's problems on outsiders, and the system that thrives on this division, it just keeps getting stronger. So, when we look back at 1871, we can't just say, wow, that was a terrible thing that happened way back then. You really have to ask, how much has really changed? Are we still repeating the same mistake? Are we letting that fear and hatred divide us while the real issues go unchecked? Because history is not just about the past. It's about what we do next. It's about whether we keep repeating the same mistakes or whether we finally choose to do the hard work and break the cycle. So where do we go from here? The Chinese Massacre of 1871 wasn't just a one-off horrible event. It was a warning, a flashing neon sign telling us exactly what happens when fear, hatred, and unchecked power collide. It's so easy to say that was then. That could never happen today. But history is not some dusty old museum piece. It is alive. And even if you take just a second to look around, you will see it repeating itself in real time. The question isn't whether the echoes of 1871 are still here. It's whether we're actually paying attention. Because here's the truth. Silence is complicity, but every single one of us has the power to make noise, to break cycles, to write a different story. So don't just let this fade into the background. Share it. Talk about it. Learn from it. Let it remind you that silence is never neutral and that history absolutely will repeat itself if we allow it to. Maybe you're asking, where do I start, Courtney? Support organizations like the ACLU who are fighting for immigrant rights every single day. Get to know your local immigrant communities, their stories, their struggles, their contributions. I pinky promise that you will learn something that will surprise you and make you probably feel deeply connected because guess what? We are all connected, whether we like it or not. And most importantly, push back. When someone in your circle starts spouting anti-immigrant rhetoric, don't sit silent. Speak up. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be confrontational. Ask questions like, why do you think that? Or why do you think it's okay to say that? Or what would you do if you were in their shoes? Share facts, like how immigrants actually contribute more in taxes than they take in benefits. And if nothing else, set boundaries. Saying that I'm not comfortable with this kind of talk is more than enough. The most important thing is to say something, because every time we stay silent, harmful ideas take root, and we already know what happens and where that can lead. As we wrap up, I want to bring us back to something I mentioned at the start of the episode. Chinese Lunar New Year. This Wednesday, families all over the world will come together to celebrate, just as they've done for centuries. And it's a reminder of no matter how much a community is tested, their traditions, their strength, and their resilience endures. The Chinese community of 1871 deserved better. Immigrants across all communities deserve better. But what gives me hope is that resilience. Traditions like Lunar New Year are proof that even in the face of unimaginable hardship, culture and community survive. Thanks for choosing to be here with me today, and I really hope that this story stays with you, because it's not just a piece of the past, it's a mirror. Maybe even a map showing us where exactly we're heading if we're not careful. Until next time, be kind, be curious, and be ready to make history.
Interested in learning more? We recommend The Chinese Must Go: Violence, Exclusion, and the Making of the Alien in America by Beth Lou Williams. Driven Out: The Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans by Jean Failser. The Making of Asian America: A History by Erica Lee, the PBS documentary Becoming American: The Chinese Experience. And find more resources and stories like this on our website, www.bygoneechoes.website